everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm David Halperin, CEO of Israel Policy Forum, and appreciate your joining us on this momentous and hopeful day. 734 days after Hamas's horrific assault on Israeli communities on October 7, 2023, it appears we have a deal at least to see the Israeli hostages who have been held in captivity by Hamas in the Gaza Strip to be released in return for at least the beginning of what could lead to a sustained end to this Gaza war. I want to thank you all for joining us, where today we'll have a chance to unpack the latest developments, what actually has happened, what does it mean, and what might we expect upcoming. I will be joined by my colleagues. Throughout this conversation, I encourage you to ask questions. There will not be a Q&A session. I encourage you to use the Q&A function to type your questions at any moment in time. I will try to get to as many questions throughout our conversation as possible. I want to thank all of those who are joining us either on our live stream or via recording. With us is, from Israel, is Neri Zilber, Israel Policy Forum Policy Advisor, and of course, host of our podcast, Israel Policy Pod. Neri is a independent journalist, regular contributor, reporter for the Financial Times, and so pleased, Neri, to have you with us. We're also joined by Nimrod Novik, Israel Policy Forum Distinguished Fellow, longtime advisor to the late President and Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who has regular dialogue with colleagues in the Arab world, and we'll want to unpack with Nimrod how this is shaking out in the regional contributions. And we're also thrilled to have with us our colleagues from Washington, Rachel Brandenburg, our Washington Managing Director and Senior Policy Analyst, and Michael Koplow, our Chief Policy Officer. It's a big panel, but really this is a conversation amongst our team. And as I was mentioning in the pre-call just a moment ago, it's actually the first time that we've had a chance to all talk about this momentous moment. So I'm eager to have this public conversation in real time and hear what you all think. And Neri, I want to start with you. Can you first just walk us through what is this agreement? How did we get here in recent days, and what should we expect in the days to come?
Sure thing, David. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be with you and all of our colleagues, along with all the watchers and hopefully listeners in future. But really, a momentous day. And we said this on, I believe, last week's webinar/podcast, a great day for civilization and everyone here in Israel and Gaza and the Middle East. But I think today is actually, that's true. There was just a surge of optimism overnight and this morning in Israel. A real sense of hope for the first time in a long time that the hostages at least were coming home, and like you said, a potential sliver of hope that this war will come to an end. But in terms of the brass tacks, I think we have to be clear about what was agreed today in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and what the Israeli government is set to approve in short order here in Israel, and what wasn't agreed to. We have to be clear, what was agreed to was really the first stage of an overall deal put forward by Donald Trump a week or so ago. And this first stage of the deal is really a ceasefire for hostage and prisoner release, i.e. What is going to be approved by the Israeli government tonight is essentially a deal that commits Israel to halt the fighting. It will pull back the IDF from most of the population centers in the Gaza Strip, and in the coming days see the release of, we hope, all the 48 hostages still languishing in captivity in Gaza, 20 of whom are still believed to be alive, in return for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, 250 of which are serving life sentences for serious terror-related offenses, i.e. Real blood on their hands. So not a small price, but this is essentially the first stage of the deal, and should be completed, we hope, in the coming days, with the added, shall we say, news value of Donald Trump himself likely coming to Israel on Sunday, at least to monitor developments, if not to actually greet the returning hostages. That's what was agreed. What wasn't agreed, essentially, was everything else. The second stage of the overall deal, the 20-point plan put forward by Donald Trump, calls for a lot of other longer-term objectives vis-a-vis Gaza and Hamas and Israel, like Hamas's disarmament, like the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, like, if not the complete withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, then from pretty much all of it, except for maybe the overall perimeter, and coupled with setting up some future governance system with international and Palestinian technocrats. I mean, essentially a new government for Gaza that still needs to be fleshed out and agreed to, and on and on. I mean, there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done, and that's all in the second stage. In terms for Israel, that will be a heavy lift in terms of actually agreeing to this and agreeing and committing itself to end the war. To answer your question, I know we'll get into it, but what happened? Donald Trump happened, truly. Donald Trump put the entire weight of the U.S. presidency and really his own U.S. presidency on the various parties, but especially on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and on the various Arab states, who I assume my colleagues know this better than I, applied their own pressure on Hamas to come to the table. So really, Donald Trump happened. And I'll just say, in terms of what we may expect moving forward, I fully expect the coming days to actually unfold relatively okay, with various caveats, perhaps having to do with deceased Israeli hostages whose bodies will take a bit more time to find and recover and rescue and bring back for burial in Israel. But it's really two competing narratives. Who do you want to believe in terms of what happens after the next few days in terms of this first stage and what comes after? Benjamin Netanyahu, who says he and his various allies here in Israel say, well, we only agreed to this first stage and we'll see what happens afterwards, and there's no real guarantee that we'll even get to agreement over the second stage. And Hamas leader Khalil Hayeh, who said about 2 hours ago that, no, we got real guarantees from the U.S. and the various other mediators, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and others, that this will actually be a permanent end to the war. So I leave it to my colleagues to decide who they want to believe.
Well, that's fascinating, Neri, because I think it's very clear that President Trump was clearly a difference maker in getting to this deal. But we are seeing two other kinds of narratives emerge. One is that this deal happened because Trump pressured Israel, and another that this deal happened because Trump was able to pressure the regional players to pressure Hamas. Nimrod, I wanted to bring you in to unpack this a little bit. The question really is, why now? Why did it come about now? And what role did Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey play in this 11th hour in pressing Hamas to actually accept a deal, which, as Neri outlined, doesn't have a guarantee there will be a phase two?
We are in the early months of the war, we already heard from neighboring countries, particularly those with substantial population like Saudi Arabia, great concern that what happens in Gaza doesn't stay in Gaza. And their concern was twofold. One, the effect of the images, the visual images from Gaza on their young population, and they saw trends of radicalization. And the second one is the overall impact of regional instability on their very ambitious socio-economic transformation plans. MBS is 2030, and the others have similar ones as well. As a result, we saw them concerned with what's going on, expressing that concern to Washington, and gradually, maybe grudgingly, accepting a role in the morning after when the Biden administration was working on it. But their impression was that the Biden administration was doing a great job in planning and a very poor one in execution, primarily because it was not willing to do the one thing that eventually, in my judgment, broke the ice, which was the pressure on Netanyahu. Once Trump enters the White House, and I will not presume to talk about Trump from the American perspective, but I'll try from a regional one. Once he entered the White House, even before he entered the White House, he demonstrated what he can do. And he took the Biden plan and made it happen, the ceasefire in January, on the one hand. On the other hand, he gave Netanyahu a pass when he broke that deal in March, 6 weeks later. So they were looking at the president that can make it happen. But the question is, will he? And when they were discussing how to pressure him, they reached the conclusion that you don't press President Trump, you tempt him. And you tempt him by providing him the setting for a win by doing yourself, by volunteering to do much of the heavy lifting. That coupled with his threat from a regional perspective of the Gaza Riviera and removing 2 million Gazans out of the Strip and so on, gave birth to the Egyptian initiative that was embraced by the Arab League in March, and even more so and more ambitious, the Saudi-French initiative of July that was endorsed by 142 countries at the UN in September. So they were signaling to him that they are willing to do much of the heavy lifting. They are willing to come into Gaza. They are willing to shoulder responsibility to Gaza, provided certain conditions are met. Now, all that got a boost, a very dramatic boost, with the Israeli strike on Qatar. And suddenly all those countries were watching Israel becoming the regional bully, striking Qatar with impunity. Qatar, an ally of the United States with a major American base there. And if Qatar can be targeted, so can anyone else. And that gave yet another boost to their willingness to shoulder responsibility and do the heavy lifting and tempt the president to go for the real deal. So I think that from an Arab regional perspective, that was the makings of the Trump effect. Just one word from an Israeli perspective, the Trump effect, and I think it started with Zelensky. That is to say, Prime Minister Netanyahu prides himself of having played with successive American presidents unscarred. And I think that the Zelensky incident sent a certain message to him. His eyes, of course, are on the elections in Israel next year. Early next year, later next year, but next year. And for that to happen, he cannot afford to have the greatest friend Israel has ever had, according to him, stand up and say Netanyahu blew it. Netanyahu is intransigent. Netanyahu is dragging the war for his own purpose. He couldn't afford that. So bookended between Zelensky and Netanyahu apologies to the Qataris, also in the same Oval Office, was the transformation of Netanyahu in terms of appreciating that he cannot play Trump.
Rachel, I want to turn to you. What are the issues? What are the questions that are sitting with you right now that you think we should be asking, and what are the developments that you think we should be looking for in the days, if not weeks, to come?
Thanks, David. Well, Neri and Nimrod both alluded to a lot of these things, and particularly the fact that, as far as we know, all that's been agreed is the initial phase of this deal. So hopefully we see everything go without a hitch between now and President Trump said recently, either Monday or Tuesday, we're going to see the hostages released. Hopefully we see all of that come to fruition without any hangups or holdups or anybody playing messy games. But then ostensibly even harder work begins to figure out the details. Neri outlined all the different pieces of this deal that haven't yet been agreed. And the 20-point plan, which I've said before was more like 20 principles, has some really meaty principles in there that are going to be both very difficult to figure out what they look like, but even more difficult to figure out in practice. Who's responsible for governance of Gaza? Who is this international board that is going to govern Gaza, be led by President Trump, include Tony Blair? Who else is going to be on that board? What Palestinians are going to be on that board? What does a PA reform plan look like? And who is in the lead? Who is financing any of this? How do they go about the reconstruction of Gaza? What does the plan for surging humanitarian aid look like? And how do we ensure that it's not just food, but also shelter and other basic humanitarian needs? What does the security perimeter look like for Israel? And then what is the long-term plan for Gaza and for the pathway to a credible, I think it was phrased, a credible pathway to a Palestinian state that was mentioned in that 19th point, if I remember correctly. None of these have yet to be addressed. And as far as we know, the details have not been matched to the principles. Additionally, from what we've seen over the last 10 months, President Trump does not tend to pay attention to any one thing for very long. So right now, there's tremendous momentum behind him and behind this plan. And remarkably, pretty much the entire world has been pushing for this to happen. Everyone praised the plan, supported it, even though it's not really perfect for anyone. But who's going to keep his eye on the ball? Is he going to keep attentive to this? Is it going to be the weight of the US president that's driving the process forward to figure out these details? Is it going to be the regional Arab states that Nimrod was talking about, who are both taking an active role in the planning, but also the implementation? And what role for the Europeans, who arguably have more facility with some of the details that are required to go about developing plans to match these principles, and who's going to pay for it? And I would guess that whatever the answers to those questions are, it's going to be a different U.S. role than we've seen in the past, where traditionally diplomacy around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, around even the Abraham Accords initially, were led by the United States. And it was the United States pulling the parties to the table, the United States putting paper on the table. I'm not sure this American administration is going to be the ones doing either of those things. So who will? Who's going to be in the lead for this process?
Michael, I want to come around to you, and I kind of have two questions for you, Michael. One is what is your take on, frankly, what Rachel just mentioned, which is Trump did succeed, but can he sustain momentum going forward? And the second is, of course, our questions are already flooding in about what this means for the Israeli coalition and for Israeli politics. And I wonder, Michael, if you could help us help touch on what you're watching in terms of the fallout on the Israeli side as well.
Sure. So on the first, I agree with Rachel. The hard part is going to come after Monday or Tuesday when the hostages come home, and then everybody has to pivot to the next thing. And getting the hostages back and getting the end of the war, those are, for President Trump, the big accomplishments. I think he even said something earlier today about, that's going to happen, and then we'll see what comes after that. So it's not just about keeping his attention focused, it's keeping everybody's attention focused and marshaling all the different actors that now have to come to bear on making sure that Gaza doesn't just go back to what it was before. And that's definitely a difficult task when you have so many spoilers out there. Hamas is going to want to paint this as a victory, and they're presumably going to, and hopefully going to, give up all the hostages in a few days. And so the only way for them to paint this as a victory is to wreck the next phase. The same goes on the Israeli side, where Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich are going to vote against this deal in the cabinet today. And they too don't want to see an end to the war and the pullout of the IDF from Gaza. So keeping on top of all of the various actors that are going to try and make sure that the next phase doesn't get off the ground is going to be difficult. And as Rachel said, we're talking about an administration that doesn't deal with these things in a traditional manner, doesn't have the same type of foreign policy process, doesn't have the same type of apparatus for follow-through, quite frankly. And President Trump got this done basically through brute force, right? He wanted it done, and so he put a plan out there, knowing that it was a plan that had things that both sides had categorically ruled out. After Arab states approved it, he then allowed the Israelis to come in and just change it. And When the Arab states objected, he told them he didn't care. He was gonna put it out anyway. When Hamas responded with a very qualified yes, and Netanyahu wanted to paint it as rejection, Trump just said, no, I'm gonna paint it as a yes. So he was able to bulldoze everybody to get to this first phase. It's gonna be a lot harder after this first phase. And I hope he's successful, but let's not mince words. This first phase is a huge accomplishment. People have been trying to get this now for 2 years, and it wasn't done, including President Trump himself, who I think probably could have forced this through in March when Israel decided that it didn't want to move to the next phase of the January ceasefire. But he decided now is the time, and he absolutely deserves all the credit for it, including sending Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to literally sit in the Israeli cabinet meeting today to make sure it gets approved. But after this phase, bulldozing everybody into the next thing, and the next thing will be harder. And so he's going to have to show an inordinate degree of focus that I don't think we've seen from him up until this point, and not just him, from his administration. On the question of Israeli politics, so it seems as if Smotrich and Ben Gvir are going to jump through all sorts of hoops to not leave the coalition. But it's hard for me to see how early elections at this point don't happen. If they don't happen, there still has to be an election a year from now, and there's certainly a world in which the government can keep things going for another year, and then it falls based on the mandatory timetable. But you still have all these issues out there. You still have Smotrich and Ben Gvir who are not happy. You still have the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who want their draft exemption, and I don't think they're getting it. And you also have the fact that Netanyahu at this point, he knows the numbers. They're not going to magically recover for him so much that he is going to win the next election outright. He's got to siphon off just a few seats so that he can push the current opposition bloc to 60 or under without any Arab parties. Because if he does that, then he can try to force a deadlock. So he's only got to peel off a couple of seats to do that. And waiting a year isn't the way to do that. The way to do that is, to my mind, to take this deal and to run on it and say, hey, look, I got the hostages back. And guess what? The IDF is still in Gaza. And guess what? The Palestinian Authority still has no real role. And guess what? We're not really going to enter into any sort of peace process with the Palestinians. And if he runs on that, he maybe can get another 1 or 2 seats back to his coalition from right-wingers who have lost their patience with him and try to force a deadlock. So I think his best bet is to try to get to early elections. Nimrod said early next year or later next year. I'd be betting on early next year, and hope that this deal and the way that he portrays it and all the ways that he's going to try to make sure it doesn't move to the next phases, run on that and see if that's enough to get him his deadlock.
And can he do that without running afield of Trump's ire? If Trump actually wants to see this advanced, I guess it will be the question.
Yeah, that's the question. And I think this is in Netanyahu's favor in some ways, because it's not just about Trump's attention span. It's about the fact that the next phases do require more sustained engagement than just putting out effectively 20 bullet points and telling everybody that they have to say yes. And he and some of his associates are very practiced at running circles around American administrations and playing out the clock and kicking the can down the road. And I wouldn't bet against him being able to do that.
Neri, I did want to ask, there's a number of questions in the chat about the terms of the hostage release deal, the Palestinian prisoners to be released. Questions about who are these prisoners, what do we know about the plan for the release, and what has been the response thus far inside Israel to those to that planned aspect of this deal?
So it won't go over that well publicly once the names of like the really heavier life termers are going to come out. Although I suspect, again, we don't know because it hasn't been made public yet, some of the higher profile individuals will not be part of this deal. But you are still going to get a sizable number of
Meaning
fairly.
Marwan Barghouti will not be part of the deal.
Marwan Barghouti will not be part of the deal. A few others will not be part of the deal, but some, by definition, will have to be part of the deal. Again, it hasn't been made public, but it's a price that most of the Israeli public is willing to pay. Perhaps not Smotrich and Ben-Gvir themselves, but a large majority of the Israeli public. So that's part of the 250, shall we say, heavier Palestinian prisoners that are set to be released. According to the terms of the deal, by the way, they're either going to be released to Gaza or exile outside of Israel, not to the West Bank. That's a significant point in and of itself. And then the rest of the 1,700 Palestinian prisoners / detainees to be released are, again, by definition, those Gazans who were picked up off the battlefield of Gaza, but after October 7th, i.e. no one that actually took part in the October 7th massacre, i.e. no Nukba terrorists. And that's also a significant point. And those 1,700 will be released back to Gaza. And that's, I believe, a few hundred Palestinian, the bodies of Palestinian prisoners also will be released, but not the Sinwar brothers, to the best of my information. So again, that's the price Israel will have to pay initially in this first stage of the deal. Again, not Israel's most favorite action to take, but a price most of this country is willing to pay to get the hostages home.
So, Nimrod, I wanted to bring in Ben Leibowitz had asked a question, which he wrote, "It remains shocking to me that Hamas would return all hostages in one tranche and eliminate one of their two sources of leverage and power, the other being their weapons." I guess the question is, if Hamas is not getting these high-profile prisoners released and they are removing their leverage, what changed in their calculation? What actually made them make this decision to ultimately release the hostages?
From everything we heard, what used to be the number one priority of Hamas under Sinwar in this kind of a situation was releasing hostages. Prisoners, freeing Palestinian prisoners. There was a story of how committed he was to those who stayed in prison when he was sent to Gaza after 23 years in Israeli prison. From what we hear over the last weeks, maybe even months, since he's gone, the importance of that factor is somewhat lesser, and organizational survival is far more important. And for that to happen, they insisted on guarantees, and we all heard about it. We don't have the language or format of what guarantees they got. But even within the Trump 20 points and an adjacent document that we all saw recently, they have some of the guarantees that they need. One guarantee that they need is that if they go in exile, if they decide to leave Gaza, they get immunity. And they got that when the U.S. committed to Qatar that it will not be attacked again, and when Israel undertook not to attack again. So Qatar is now a safe haven, a foolproof safe haven for Gaza terrorists, assuming they are not involved in active violence. So that's one. The second is end of war. And from everything we heard, they received American guarantees signed, as well as from Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. That's it. That's the end of war. Now, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey is nice, but U.S. is far more significant. So I think that what changed was that Hamas military capabilities have been so degraded. Its military formations have been demolished a year ago. Its leadership disappeared, was killed, first, second, and third layer. And those remaining are not the kind of powerful leadership figures. The ganging up of the Arab world, and it was not just the three countries that we keep mentioning: Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, but also Saudi Arabia is there, and the UAE is there, and Jordan is there. It's a very powerful Arab consensus, and apparently they reached the conclusion that that's the best they can get.
What is the expectation around Hamas disarmament? I mean, clearly there's a lot of skepticism that we're actually going to see a process that leads to full disarmament. I know the Hamas response to the deal made clear references to their continued role in the future of the Palestinian politics and the Palestinian National Project, which of course is not what the Israelis want to hear or accept, let alone. Of course, Bibi has been opposed to the Palestinian Authority's return. So, Nimrod, how do you expect this process to play out in a way that would be in any way acceptable?
Well, assuming that the consensus of pessimism about phase two in this room is proven overstated, and phase two does get launched. There was a lot of work done, primarily by Egypt, but Egypt was the driver, but there were quite a few passengers in the Arab world that developed a two-phase approach to Hamas disarmament. In phase one, the weapons are to be assembled in deposits in Gaza under the supervision of the so-called Arab Palestinian force that is supposed to run security, law and order in the Strip in the interim phase. And phase two, those weapons are to be exported to Egypt, never to come back. According to those involved, the Hamas public posture on this is not the private posture on this, and that they have Hamas consent that if all else works in terms of the morning after, the day after management, then Hamas will not resist giving up its strategic weapons. To the question of whether it is confined to rockets and missiles and RPGs, or does it also include the individual Kalashnikov? They didn't go into those details, or at least they have not shared it with others. But the principle is there, and it found expression in the Saudi-French initiative, which calls for Hamas disarmament, as well as the Trump 20 points.
Rachel, we have a lot of questions about whether this will enable the resumption of regional diplomacy, Israel-Saudi normalization, and the like. But I wonder if you could speak how, what, if any, impact does this have on what has been happening between Israel and Lebanon, between Israel and Syria, between Israel and Saudi, the sort of the wider regional picture and the ability for the United States to engage in diplomacy? Because as Donald Trump outlined in the last couple of days, this is not a hostage ceasefire deal. This is peace in the Middle East, as he described. This is everything. What is your take on the regional opportunities?
Yeah, I think he described it as the greatest day in civilization. I think Neri gave a nod to it in his opening too. We may have a few months to years to decades until we see peace in all of our time, but here's to hoping it moves fast. I think for President Trump, he certainly wants to continue moving on to what we've long heard are his sort of grander ambitions of expanding the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were his legacy. They were his sort of diplomatic baby. And in my assessment, one of the elements that really led to the recent momentum to get to his 20-point plan and to bring everyone around the current process was seeing a real threat to the Abraham Accords when Israel was about to vote on formally annexing the West Bank, and the UAE came out and said, "Hey, this will not only threaten the expansion of the Abraham Accords, but it could threaten current agreements." And then Saudi Arabia amplified that. Then the Israeli strikes in Doha led to even greater unity among the Gulf states around finding a common way forward. One of the things that's been remarkable to me over the past 2 years, and particularly over the past year, have been that the conversation about Israel-Saudi normalization has remained on the table, despite the war in Gaza, despite the horrendous things that have happened not only on October 7th, but over the past 6 months and the humanitarian crisis. Nimrod talked about the challenge that Arab leaders, and particularly in the Gulf, have had with their populace, the Arab street, sort of suddenly seeing images of starving Gazans, of dying children, of sort of the horrors that have transpired in Gaza, causing real domestic challenges. And I think there is a common understanding that ultimately greater regional integration, Israel's further integration diplomatically, economically, in addition to militarily, but a lot of that has already been happening, that will only lead to greater stability. And there is a real interest in regional stability for the sake of their own domestic agendas. Even more remarkable of the last 6 months has been the processes that have begun with Syria and Lebanon. And on all three of these arenas, there is real opening at the moment, but I think it's going to take time. And President Trump even seemed to understand when he spoke from was it Riyadh, Dubai? I don't remember on his Gulf trip exactly where he was, but he said, "I still hope to see Saudi-Israel normalization happen, but I understand the Saudis will need it to happen in their own time." Also, remarkably, we're not even a year into his administration. So he still has time. He still has time to get this initial deal done, bring an end to the war, and then begin the path toward broader regional integration, whether it's Saudi-Israel normalization before the end of his term, or some sort of Syria-Israel demilitarization, detente, diplomatic agreement that comes sooner. And in Lebanon, there really is a new government for the first time in years who are genuinely interested in not only reclaiming their country from Hezbollah, but seemingly open to a diplomatic process with Israel. None of this, I think, can begin in earnest until the war in Gaza really comes to an end. So hopefully we'll see this latest initial deal come to fruition on Monday. And then along with everything else we've discussed, some of this regional diplomacy can commence again. But there too, I think it's just the beginning of reopening those conversations. And it's still going to take a little time to see where they go.
Just to follow up, Rachel, we had one question in from Michael Rothstein. It was the simple question: can Iran spoil the Trump deal?
Iran can spoil anything if they want to. I don't think, I neither think and I hope that we will not see them spoil this initial phase. Just as the region wants to see the war in Gaza end, nobody wants to see another war with Iran. The Gulf states have developed their own diplomatic relationships with Iran. Nobody wants to see a nuclear Iran, but even less, getting the construct wrong, even more, nobody wants to see another round of war with Iran. So I think between the general interest in stability and the real diminished capabilities of their proxies, there's not a ton they can do to spoil the deal in the near term. That doesn't mean that they can't reconstitute capabilities in the medium term and figure out a way to spoil whatever comes next in the forthcoming phases of this process.
Yeah. So, Michael, the last 2 years of this war has had a profound impact on the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, the views of Israel inside the United States. Now that hopefully we are seeing this come to a sustainable end and the release of hostages and beginning to rebuild from this chapter, what are you watching in terms of the trajectory and the trends in the future of U.S.-Israel relations?
U.S.-Israel relations are going to shift. There's no question to me about that. We're seeing it on too many different vectors. Whether you look at elected officials, where in the Democratic Party, It's pretty much now mainstream to be in favor of some sort of restriction on security assistance to Israel. If you look at the Republican Party, not as much the politicians, but the influencers, for lack of a better word, who are really driving MAGA culture, Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and Candace Owens and a whole host of others, the relationship with Israel is being questioned. And when you look at U.S. public opinion, in some ways, that's actually, I think, the maybe the most impactful in the long term, because we now see polls, and it's not just one. It's now pretty much any organization that does this, where for the first time in the history of polling, people sympathize with Palestinians more than they sympathize with Israelis. For the first time in the history of the polling, majorities of Americans want to end all assistance to Israel, not place restrictions on it, but end it. We see pluralities of Americans who think that Israel is purposely killing civilians in Gaza. We see pluralities of Americans, and in one poll, actually a majority of Americans, who believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. These are not numbers that are just going to stop with the end of the war. People now have imprinted in their minds a view of what Israel is and how it behaves and its value or lack of value to the United States. So the relationship is going to shift. And I think it's going to be really critical for policymakers to understand the ways in which it's going to shift and get ahead of it, because insisting, as many have in the past, that the relationship is absolutely, unshakable and unbreakable, I don't think that that's true anymore. And relying on some of the old talking points about Israel itself is also not going to work. And just assuming that there's going to be another 10-year MOU with $3.8 billion a year or more to Israel without it causing a huge fight, again, in both parties, I don't think that that's a realistic assumption either. So everybody's going to have to recalibrate, and particularly for American Jewish organizations, including ours, that support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship and want to see this relationship continue at a high level, recognizing the importance of it to both sides, and also want to see a secure Jewish democratic Israel, leaving aside the particulars of U.S.-Israel relations. American Jewish organizations are going to have to really think long and hard about how they make the case for Israel, and to not take things for granted that they always took for granted, such as rock solid American popular support almost no matter what Israel does.
The end of the war does not necessarily mean the end to the trends that we've seen.
No.
Neri, I did want to ask you this. We've talked a lot about Gaza, but there's nothing, as far as I understand, about the West Bank. I'm curious how the PA has been responding, and if we should anticipate, as has been in the past, Netanyahu making arrangements with far-right coalition partners to agree to one set of policies and essentially be compensated with developments, whether that be settlements or the like in the West Bank. I'm curious if we have anything afoot of that nature, or what you're watching in that arena.
Sure. I mean, obviously, all focus for a long time now has been on Gaza, but the West Bank, equally important and not getting enough attention. Look, the Palestinian Authority and President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is playing ball like every other country in the region, and came out in support of the agreement and ceasefire and end to the war. And that's all well and good. I think they will have to calibrate their own steps in the coming weeks and months about what they need to do to put themselves in the best position to play an active role in post-war Gaza, if and when we get to it, i.e. Genuine reforms that they committed to, by the way, irrespective of this Gaza deal brokered by Trump, but even as commitments to the French and the Saudis as part of the overall push a few weeks ago, who remembers now, for recognition of Palestinian statehood. That's all steps that Abu Mazen committed to. We got word a few days ago, and I confirmed it to be true, that they've started, shall we say, a internal Fatah reform process bringing in people that were kicked out and physically and politically exiled, bringing them back into the fold that could in the future perhaps play a role in the Gaza Strip. I think that's all for the good. I think promised elections for next year, I think would go a long way, not only in bolstering the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, but perhaps even working to hold elections in Gaza as well, and trying to coalesce the Palestinian Authority across both territories. That's, again, irrespective really of Israel and its own policies. To your second question, David, I expect the worst. It's a long and tried and true Netanyahu formula, divide and rule, literally kind of divide the West Bank from Gaza. If you're kind of propping up Gaza on some level, you're putting down the West Bank on another level. And really, people like Bezalel Smotrich have done a lot of negative things on the West Bank, especially under cover of the overall Gaza war. Again, I don't expect that to stop tomorrow if there's a stop in the Gaza war. The only thing that may kind of slow it down or halt it is Smotrich and Ben Gvir actually leaving the government being toppled, heading to snap elections, and in future a different Israeli government. Again, we can all hope. And by the way, going back to what Michael laid out previously, I also think that early elections in the first quarter of 2026 is a more likely scenario than not. I think Netanyahu took that into account when he was, let's say, pushed and prodded by Trump into this agreement. The difference between, say, March, when he restarted the war, and now, many things, but A, he didn't bomb Iran just yet. He hadn't yet taken over the vast majority of the Gaza Strip, either to stay there or to give it back. And he wasn't entering an election year anyway, right? We've already entered into an election year in Israel, and so he has a lot less to lose in terms of heading into elections. And he always likes to choose the timing and the issues that he goes into an election with. And so there are worse things to do than kind of tout your achievements on the battlefield over the past 2 years and get all the hostages back. And, oh, by the way, have the most powerful man in the world, giving a speech in the Knesset touting how great your diplomatic and political prowess is, which is likely to happen on Sunday.
All very good points. I want to bring in a question from Howard LaFranchi, one of Neri's old colleagues at the Christian Science Monitor, for Nimrod, which comes back to this question of disarmament, which is how to get around, as he describes, the chicken and egg dilemma of Hamas needing to disarm and the guarantees that Hamas wants first that Israel will not restart the war.
Look, if we want to be optimistic and assume for a minute that phase 2 of the plan gets going, much work has been done. I will even backtrack a bit. Much of what we hear in the Saudi French plan, in the Trump 20 plans, in the previously Egyptian plan, all draw on very thorough staff work that was done on the subject during the last year of the Biden administration. And a lot of work was done on DDR, as well as on all other elements of the plan, to the point of even the real-time communication, deconflicting the terms of engagement of the Israeli phasing out and the third-party force phasing in. How do you prevent friction? And what does it mean that you respect Israel's right of self-defense when Israel is out and someone else is in?
Yeah,
all this was worked out.
No, sorry, I was just going to jump in to explain DDR to the audience.
It's decommissioning of weapons, and how do you integrate former Hamas employees into the new structure, so you don't end up in a Iraqi situation where people were left with no source of income and ended up with ISIS.
I apologize.
Yeah. So on top of it, I'm sorry I forgot. Forgot to mention it earlier. A lot of work was done by the Tony Blair team, and the plan that they have put together also draws on previous work done by others. So the mechanics of it and the politics of it will work should the two parties play ball. If indeed we're going to have forces from 5-6 Arab countries plus Indonesia, Italy and France just announced that they are willing to contribute forces to it. If you're going to have the billions of dollars from the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the others, if all that mechanism of a Palestinian indigenous governance by experts, overseen by the World Peace Institute, chaired by President Trump and managed by Tony Blair. If all that comes to fruition, I think that squaring the commitment of Israel will have less incentive to resume the war, and Hamas will have little option but to accept. But I don't want to say that this is in fantasy land, because we saw President Trump within a week, like a powerful particles accelerator, forcing everybody to move at hypersonic speed and produce an agreement that most of us assumed was unreachable. So who knows?
I'm actually curious, Rachel, your take on this as well, because you have this experience working at the Pentagon and the post-Iraq and ISIS challenge and recovering territory that has really been decimated, and thinking about how you recover from these zones of conflict. What are the sort of lessons learned that should be brought in this conversation?
Oof, there are a lot of comparisons, but a whole lot more differences. I think the first one is it takes time, and it takes sustained attention, and it takes a whole lot of actors committing to continue rowing in the same direction for quite a while. In the case of Iraq, you had the UN at the center in a way that is different from now. And there were entities, including particularly the UN, that followed very standard procedures of sort of how do you go from conflict status to reconstruction. There's an initial stabilization phase. Then there's sort of the, how do you get people to a point where they can live day to day with the basic needs, and then the infrastructure enough that you can reconstitute your life in the medium term, and then sort of what does the economy look like and all of those things. Disarmament is even harder. I won't add to or Nimrod knows far more than I do about that process, and also what's been done in the context of Hamas. They all need to be coordinated, and there has to be a governance structure. In the case of Iraq, the United States and the entire counter-ISIS coalition was working with the central government. Having a central governing structure in Gaza, whether it's initially this international board, Institute of World Peace, what Nimrod described, what I described earlier, or some other entity, will be critical to ensure that any process put forward, whether humanitarian, disarmament, just fulfilling people's basic needs, actually gets stood up and then sustained. You have the added challenge in the case of Gaza, that is ensuring Israel's security and the safety and stability, not only for Gaza, but for whatever constitutes the border zone, the demilitarization zone, the no man's land between Israel and Gaza. And Gaza is not a very big place. So the layered challenges are tremendous. I think an initial indicator will be who are the countries, not only who pledge to contribute to this effort, but then who follow through, whether it's with material, with personnel, with money, so that each of these layers can get established and then sustained.
Michael, we're going to give you the last word. What's on your mind as we go into this momentous weekend?
So I'm very slightly optimistic that we'll get to some part of phase two. I don't think we're going to see the 20-point plan, exactly as envisioned and laid out. But as I said, slightly optimistic that things are not just going to get completely stalled after phase one. And the thing on my mind is if it gets a little bit down the road and then it stalls and it becomes clear that Hamas still retains power in Gaza and there's no international stabilization force that's actually going to be stood up, and Gaza basically turns into a low-grade civil war between Hamas and clans. What's the follow-through going to be at that point? Are the U.S. and other actors in the international community going to kind of stand back and watch and say, okay, well, at least this is better than what we had before? Is Israel going to stick to its new doctrine, which is it sees any threat and it rushes in? Or is it also going to sit back? What's going to be the impact of a different government, which I think, a year from now, there probably will be. So looking at the deal and seeing how it gets implemented, I think is important. But the more interesting and may end up being more relevant question to me is how do all these actors respond if phase two doesn't start or breaks down? Is everybody going to have a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil type thing? Or are people going to actually have the wherewithal to actively jump in and try to do something about it?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, Rachel, Neri, and Nimrod, and thank you everyone for joining us. We encourage you to tune into Israel Policy Pod, of course, the podcast that Neri hosts each and every week with conversations with news makers and opinion shapers, and of course, Michael's weekly Koplow column each Thursday. I, for one, am excited to travel next week to Israel and see both Neri and Nimrod on this momentous week. Thank you all again for joining us. We encourage you to follow us on social media and consider supporting Israel Policy Forum's work at israelpolicyforum.org/support. Thank you very much, and we look forward to meeting on future days with the same level of hope that we will see better days to come. This is indeed a momentous moment, which we will celebrate even as we recognize the significant pitfalls ahead with the additional phases of this deal. And we will be thinking of our friends and colleagues in Israel in the days to come in anticipation for the release of those hostages. Thank you all once again, and thanks team.